Welcome into the best chess opening to crush your opponents rated below 1500. I'm Grandmaster Igor Smirnov, and let's go ahead and get started. I'm talking about the Scotch Gambit. Here you're attacking the pawn in the middle of the board, plus you're also potentially ready to move the pawn forward and chase away the knight. Therefore, they will pretty much always take on d4, expecting you to capture back. But here comes the first surprise for your opponents. You play bishop c4. You prioritize quick development. You can take this pawn back anytime in the future if you want to, but for now, you just want to complete your development quickly and start putting pressure onto your opponent. In this position, your opponents will usually develop their knight or bishop one way or the other, and the most played move is knight to f6, so let's start from this one. They're attacking your pawn, but that is not a problem, because as soon as they get their knight out, you can always push this pawn forward and chase the knight away. And what I really love about the Scotch Gambit is that your opponent really needs to know quite a lot about the Scotch Gambit to survive the opening phase, because there is no easy way for them just to play common developing moves and, get a good position. It does not work against the Scotch game. They have to know precise opening variations, such as in this position. Just a quick spoiler, that the only good move for black that basically keeps them in the game is the counterintuitive counter blow pawn d5. But certainly, beginner to intermediate level players rarely even aware of this idea, and again, even after that, it's certainly not easy. Now, let's start from more natural moves that beginner players will typically play. So here, the knight needs to move somewhere. Definitely they do not want to drop it back to g8, it's just too passive. If they move it to e4, then here the knight is still quite vulnerable, because notice that this pawn takes away all these squares where it could possibly go to, and in the future you can always attack it with your bishop or with your rook along the e-file, so it's actually not a great idea for black as well. Now g4 is what players play most of the time, because they hope for this double attack against your pawn on e5, and they hope it will give them some time to complete their development. But here's another unpleasant surprise. Now, if you're playing against somebody really strong, of course you could just castle and build up your attack gradually, but I doubt that really strong players will play knight g4 to begin with. So against beginners to intermediate level opponents, here comes bishop takes f7 sacrifice that usually finishes the game real quick. Now they have to accept it, and now knight to g5 comes with a check, plus it opens up this discovered attack to their knight. So your idea is basically you're getting your piece back, and you expose their king along the way so that you can keep attacking later. Now, the most played move by black is king to g8, trying to hide the king back here in the corner, and now there is another little trick. Instead of taking the knight, there's nothing wrong with that, you could play this move, but there is the other one, which is trickier. It's queen to f3, and I really love this one. Now, they see that you're going to play queen f7, sort of scholar's checkmate almost, and they definitely will notice this idea and will play one or the other move to counter that. But the tricky part is you also have the second idea. It is queen to d5 check, and you also can attack with this left hook, and this is what your opponents will most of the time overlook. And by the way, even if they noticed it, it's not at all easy to find the right defensive move. So here, if they play knight takes e5 or anything else, covering the square f7, then you just execute your hidden threat, queen to d5, and that wins the game. So literally, this is a checkmate in 10 moves against really common moves of black. The second most played move by black here is developing their bishop and guarding their extra pawn in the middle of the board, but you attack it once more, and now if your opponent does nothing special, you can take this pawn in the future and attack their bishop. And if they play another natural move, just take your pawn on c3, this is basically already a losing error. Think about this, how crazy that is. Black seemingly played very logical moves, and yet basically they're done after this bishop takes f7 check. It is a similar tactic. You see, it's quite common to sacrifice something on the f7 square because it's the most vulnerable square of your opponent. Now, after king takes, there is queen to d5. It's a double attack to the king and bishop. So the idea is similar to the previous variation. You want to get your piece back, and along the way, you expose the king, making it very easy for you to attack it afterwards. The king comes back, and now you could take the bishop straight away, but it is prudent to also play this in-between check to h5, provoking them to push the g-pawn forward, and now you finally take the bishop back. But the idea is we now have this additional weak diagonal, which is going to be useful for our attack. For example, this pawn on c3 is currently hanging. You're going to take it probably with a knight. And if black takes by themselves on b2, then guess what? Now you just recapture and you're already threatening the rook. Notice how good it is for us that the pawn right here stands not on g7 covering the diagonal but on g6. And now we're hitting the rook, it's really great, and plus they've got an exposed king. Taking your other pawn on b2 in fact only helps white to develop their bishop, therefore it is better for black to play something else, trying to complete their development, but it doesn't really help, because now you're hitting the rook, but their main problem is not even the rook, but the fact that their king is centralized. Like right now, the other problem is of course this double Nightburger, which is a real issue, but even after black defends it, your plan is super simple. You just want to play e5, break open the center, get to the king and checkmate it. And although the plan is simple, there is not much black can do against it. If they try queen e7, you could play rook to e1 and then e5, or even break open the center straight away. Your position is so strong that you can sacrifice a knight temporarily and then put the rook to e1, and on the next turn, because of everything is overpinned across every direction, you're going to take this knight, start hitting the king and queen, and you'll probably win the game within a couple moves. The third most played move of black here is pawn to h6. It does make some sense. You have just developed your bishop to c4, taking aim at this pawn on f7, and therefore they may expect you to play something like knight g5, aiming for, sort of fried liver attack in the future, and this is what they're trying to stop by moving their pawn to h6 and taking control of this square. Now, it's all good, but there is one major drawback. They're wasting time. They're not developing their pieces, which gives you an idea that you can speed up your attack and try to crush your opponent quickly. So the way I love to handle this is to play c3, offering them to take it on c3, and then you don't even recapture, like you could, but it's even stronger to just castle. You're playing something similar to the Danish Gambit, but again, it's even strengthened version of the Danish Gambit because they wasted time for this useless move of h6. Now, if they do nothing, you just recapture. If they take, then now you have these two monstrous bishops. You're far ahead in development, and if they ever try to bring the knight out, it never works because of e5, and you just keep attacking this knight and chasing it around the board. If instead they try something like d6 to control this square, then since you're so far ahead in development, all you need to do is to break open the center and get to the king. So you could play something like rook e1 and then push the central pawn. Now, of course, your opponent can theoretically play different moves. I'm just showing you the overall plan of how you're going to attack. Get a lead in development, break open the center. Now, you could break open the e-file. Quite often, you can play queen b3, forming a battery against, their king and possibly even a knight across this diagonal, also very strong. But rook e1 is also pretty good, trying to break open the e-file. What can they do? If they try to pin your knight, hoping to slow down your attack, you can ignore it and still push in the middle of the board, still trying to open up the e-file. If they take, hoping that this pin is going to save them, guess what? It isn't. You can sacrifice your queen. And after they take it, you just keep attacking, this time with this bishop check, and you win in all the variations. If they cover, knight takes c6 comes with just way too many threats against everything. You just pick up all the material, win the game. If instead they try to avoid this by moving the king, then there is a fancy double checkmate. I published some videos about the Scotch Gambit in the past, and you guys have been asking me in comments about this check bishop to b4. What should white do in this case? Now, certainly we're not going to just cover passively, we wish to attack. And the cool thing about this is that you can use a similar idea to the previous variation, where you play c3, offering them to take this pawn. If not, you're going to take something, and then instead of recapturing, which is fine, but you can play castles, again, kind of playing the similar Danish Gambit idea, where you just get a huge lead in development. Now this bishop from b2 actually is hitting this pawn as well as the rook, therefore knight to f6 is more or less forced. And now usual thing here is to play e5, kicking this knight away. But in this particular case, I love the other variation much more, because unless your opponent is super advanced, there is no way they can get out of this. So you go knight g5 first, hitting the pawn, and after they castle, you then play e5. And the nice thing about this is that now this knight literally has no good squares to go to. By the way, I gotta mention that this pawn is guarded by your bishop, right? So they can't just take it for free, they're gonna lose the knight. But now, how about this knight? It cannot go here because you control it with your bishop and queen. It can't go here because of your knight from g5. It also can't move across this diagonal because of your queen. You see, that is why we played knight g5 on the previous move. It took away all these squares where the black knight could possibly retreat. Now, the only square left for the knight is going back to e8, but it's just very passive. And now the king is quite exposed. It lost its final defender, so now you can throw the queen out and just threaten checkmate in one, and you win the game really on the spot. So h6 is the only move. Now knight takes f7, you threaten the queen, and it's just game over. Like whether they move the queen or not, if they try to give up some material, it doesn't help because you form this battery, and on the next move, that is just a checkmate. If instead they try to move the queen away, it's not going to be helpful because of this double check. So somehow in this opening we have a lot of double checks here. The king needs to move, and then you just move the knight anywhere, and it is a checkmate. What if you're facing a more experienced opponent who knows how to handle the Scotch Gambit? Then they're going to play knight f6, and as you push this pawn forward and attack their knight, they're going to play the correct move. They shouldn't move the knight anywhere. The only right move for black here is this counterattack pawn d5. They want to trade their knight for your bishop. And for you, it's better not to, because in this case, if you allow them to do so, they're also having this strong center, their pieces are getting involved into the game very actively, and it's actually not what you want. Therefore, instead, they attack your bishop, you just move it right here to b5. You put your bishop to an active square, you're pinning their knight, plus this knight on f6 is still attacked, therefore they will need to finally move it. Now they move it to e4, and the situation is far better for them. Thanks to this pawn on d5, this knight is protected, and therefore at least you cannot easily trap it here in the middle of the board. Anyways, you take on d4, and now you capitalize on the pin, and you threaten to capture the knight. Therefore, they will defend it by going bishop to d7. Now there is some tension right here. So, should you take by a bishop or a knight? Well, it's better to use your bishop, because the downside of taking right here with a knight is that after the trade, they get an extra tempo hitting your bishop. You have to waste time retreating the bishop, and you do not want that. So let's take it back. Instead, it's easier to trade off your bishop and then to simply castle. And of course, your opponents can play different moves here. I'll tell you in general what is your plan and what is your setup so that you know how to handle this position. They will develop this bishop to e7 or c5, doesn't really matter. C5 is more active, so let's talk about that. Now you've got the move pawn f3 hitting their knight. The knight needs to move, but then you can gain one more tempo playing f4. Almost as if you didn't know that the pawn could move 2 squares forward at a time, but it makes sense because you've been attacking the knight all along the way. The knight will move somewhere, again, doesn't matter too much, and then you can just complete your development. You also solidify this knight so that this pin does not annoy you anymore. After they castle, it's time to develop this knight. So where should you move it? To c3 or to d2? Well, developing it to c3, like the downside is after the trade, you'll have to double your pawns, right? So it's easier to develop it right here on d2. Now you challenge their knight. If they do nothing, you're going to take it and disrupt their pawn chain. So they'll probably take it themselves, and now after queen takes d2, the opening stage is over, and you've got a pretty good position. You're slightly better. You have these advanced pawns right here, ready to roll, potentially, in the future. And again, let me tell you real quick, what is your middle game plan here, because that is where a lot of players stuck. They don't know what to do next. Now, basically, first off, again, these two pawns are extremely dangerous. Your opponent needs to watch over them, because this is your pawn majority. If your opponent does nothing special, let me just play some irrelevant moves by black, and allows you to advance this pawn, this is basically it. This is game over. You will just get to the king and checkmate it pretty quickly. Black needs to seek some counterplay. And what could they do? Well, they could try to capitalize on their pawn majority. So they need to move the bishop out of the way and then try to advance these pawns and attack your pieces, across these files on d4 and e3. But good thing for you is that you can blockade these pawns so that they can't move forward by retreating the knight to b3. And it's a very nice prophylactic move where you take good control over these squares so that black cannot advance these pawns. Moreover, you can land your knight or a bishop on these squares in the future. Now your opponent will play whatever, and then now c5 is no longer a threat because that will drop this pawn. So you can play rook e1, another very standard and good move across all the openings, just bringing your last piece into play and also potentially supporting these two pawns. And then after whatever move of black, another common move here is queen c3, reinforcing your control over these two squares. Again, you just strengthen your blockade. Plus in this situation, you also hit this pawn on c6. And after black defends it somehow, you can then, start occupying these squares. From here, you attack the rook. If they ever trade bishop for bishop, great for you. After that, they will totally lose control over all these dark squares. These pawns will be permanently blockaded. Now you hit the queen, and in the long run, you're probably going to start advancing these pawns, on the king side, pushing the f pawn, and just utilizing your pawn majority. So that is your middle game plan. Also, a lot of you guys messaged me saying that you've been stuck in your chess progress for some time and your results are inconsistent. Sometimes you're playing really good games, but in other times you're just blundering and you're not sure what to do about this. Good news, I've put together a special bundle called Boost Your Elo to 2000, where I've included everything that you need to get yourself to this next level. So if you're interested, you can click the link below the video and check this out. Also, let me know what openings you wish me to cover next, and I'll talk to you soon.